You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about the bisexual killer Butler. Now, this vintage case is anything but boring. An expert con man became what he believed to be a criminal mastermind, and before long, the crime had escalated to becoming a serial killer. With a simple reinvention, he changed himself from the poor boy he grew up as to the perfect gentleman, a man who could get close to millions of dollars in order to steal it. I also want to thank Vessi, a sponsor who allows me to continue making these videos. Now, Vessi has the most amazing waterproof shoes. They're 100% waterproof, and they have quickly become my most worn shoes. Now, they are actually made from a custom waterproof layer called Dymatext, which helps with the not only moisture getting in, but also allowing the heat and moisture from your feet to be able to escape as well. It doesn't get trapped, and it feels super comfortable. The shoes themselves are extremely comfortable. I've been wearing mine on my evening walks, and here in Kansas with the unpredictable weather, it's been so nice to know that whether it's snowing, whether it's raining, or whether it's just extremely hot, these shoes are still going to be my go-tos. I've been able to focus so much more on my health, and I love the actual design of the shoes. You can pick from a few different designs and styles on their website, and it goes with pretty much anything. Vessi is also eco-friendly, 100% vegan, and of course, cute as well. And I have actually got a discount for you guys from Vessi. Use my link below with code Brooke for $25 off each pair of adult Vessi shoes. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1977 in London, and the Scott Elliott family lived in Chelsea. This was Walter and Dorothy, who had been a married couple who had been together for quite some time. Walter was an 82-year-old and Dorothy was 60 years old. They had a bit of an age difference, but that didn't stop them from being together. Walter had gone out to fight in the Coldstream Guards in the First World War. Now, after that, he actually went to work for Bombay Company, which traded goods from Britain to India. Eventually, he did get promoted to the company director while simultaneously taking over the hill farming on his family's estate. Now, he was an extremely hard worker, and when the Second World War began, he actually joined the fight as a specialist civil servant. On top of all of this, he was a politician who served one term as a member of parliament. During that time, he was married to a woman named Maria von Grolier, but that did end in divorce. And then in 1948, that same year, he met Dorothy Nunn, and she was the daughter of a rich Calcutta merchant. Now, over 12 years later, Walter would be retired from both his estate business and the actual Bombay Company. However, they were extremely wealthy even after being retired, even said to be millionaires. They lived in a flat on Sloane Street on Richmond Court, and Walter was said to spend most of his time collecting antiques. That was just something he loved to do. But by 1977, both Dorothy and Walter weren't really doing well health-wise. They were getting up there in age, and Dorothy was spending most of her time at the nursing homes trying to get help for different illnesses, and meanwhile Walter was taking these pills that would make him very sleepy and almost delusional to fight the pain that he was going through. They finally decided to hire a butler, not only to take care of themselves but also to take care of the home and, the bills that had to be paid and just the meals and the cleaning, and they also had a housekeeper as well. Little did they know this would be a deadly hire. On December 9th of 1977, Dorothy was meant to be at a nursing home, and she was supposed to come back that morning. Now, when Walter woke up, he didn't really see her. She hadn't come to bed, and he, through the grogginess of his sleeping pills, had remembered that even earlier that morning he had woken up to a sound, and he walked outside and he saw their new butler, and the butler had said, "Oh, if you heard a sound, that was just Dorothy waking up from a nightmare, but she's okay now." And so, Walter didn't even really understand what was going on, and in the days of his sleeping pills when the butler said, "Oh, you can go back to bed," that's just what he did. Later that morning, when he did finally wake up and was coming more to than he was that morning, he looked outside and saw the butler opening the door for Dorothy, or who he thought to be Dorothy. She was wearing her winter coat and her favorite hat. This was like a big fur coat that was very noticeable even from far away, and so Walter decided to follow his wife to the car and get inside. He was given more pills for the day from his butler, and they all headed away from the home. He had no idea that the woman sitting next to him was not the love of his life, and he was headed for his death. The two would vanish, and no one would know anything about their whereabouts until after Christmas of that year. But this wouldn't be because their bodies would be discovered. You see, on January 15th of 1978, a hotel manager had called the police due to two suspicious men in North Berwick at the Blenheim Home Hotel. The manager was worried that he was not going to get paid for their room. He said they dressed nicely, they were very kind, but there was just something off about them. He gave the descriptions of the men as well as the car that they had driven there, and that is when investigators arrived. And they found the car first, and so they kind of started just inspecting it a bit, and they found that it was a rental car, but that the license plate did not belong to that car. This number should have been on a Ford Escort, but it was on a Ford Granada. And due to this, they knew that this was possibly a stolen car. So they took these two men, when they eventually found them, they were eating at the little hotel area, and they brought them in for questioning. One was as white as a sheet, but they really didn't know why, because as much as a stolen car was a crime, it wasn't anything too crazy. However, they would also bring that stolen car to the police station for inspection. And when they opened the trunk, they would get more than they bargained for. A body would be discovered, and now investigators had much more to charge them with than a stolen car. They knew that these two men could be killers, but they had no idea just what they were getting themselves into with these two men. Both men were officially arrested, and they were both identified, one being a 54-year-old named Archibald Hall, and the other being a 39-year-old named Michael Kiddo. Now, Archibald had been born on June 17th of 1924 in Scotland to a military man and his 22-year-old girlfriend. They had gotten married quickly after realizing that she was pregnant, and they did later adopt his little sister, who would be named Violet, when he was 10 years old. He had never had any friends growing up, from what investigators could find. He was more of a loner. He would sneak out from school to go watch different musicals, and he hated his name and would often go by Roy. Now, at 13, he had to go to court for theft, and he ended up blaming it on other boys and being influenced by them. Now, his father rejoined the army at this point, and so they had to move to England, and his parents hoped that due to this move, Archibald's behavior would get a lot better. But the armed forces then raided their home randomly. The parents had no idea why. However, they then found in Archibald's closet that he had Nazi paraphernalia, as well as a shrine to Hitler in his closet. His father was discharged at this point, but they did just keep it on record saying that it was because he was just too old. It was a very strange time for the whole family because the mother was also pregnant, but it was believed that she was pregnant by another officer and not her husband. She ended up having this boy who would be named Donald. And Archibald's father did sign the birth certificate, but everyone really knew that he wasn't the father. At only 15, Archibald was breaking into homes, and at 17, he would be sentenced to prison for the first time. This is where he was deemed mentally unstable and sent to 3 different mental hospitals, only to escape them all. A judge then had psychiatrists give a psych eval, and they found that he was certifiably insane. He was deemed apathetic and completely unemotional. He was also deemed a danger to society. He had no remorse and no moral sense. Now, he allegedly, during this time period, put a knife to his father's throat over his jacket. And one of the escapes from the mental institute was due to his mother helping him and taking care of him while he was being searched for by police. Archibald continued to steal from homes, from people, from stores, but he was caught every time. He wasn't this criminal mastermind. He was really quite bad at being a thief. He then began a career being a jewel thief. He said, "I had an appreciation of jewels and fine antiques. Just holding jewels made my private hard. I would steal beautiful jewels from rich people. It was a conscious career decision." After not getting any better with escaping the law, he turned to make money from wealthy women and men. He would seduce them, he would get them back into the hotel room, and then he would leave when they were asleep with all of their money. Now, these women could be seduced in public, but the men had to be seduced in private, as it was illegal to be gay during this time. Archibald was known to be a bisexual man. He did have a job of sorts, but it was one that he created himself. He would go and get cans from the Red Cross to help them with donations, and he would go out and he would say, any donation is fine, but bills are better. And so he would get all these donations, and yet he would only turn in the pennies to the Red Cross and keep the rest for himself. At 20, he opened a shop selling his stolen goods, and at 21, he decided to officially move to London because the police were on his tail. They knew exactly who he was, what he did, and in London, he would try to sell the stolen jewelry he had from Scotland and would be arrested almost immediately. But while in jail, he decided to change his life. He would study antiques, and he took speech lessons to dissolve his Scottish accent and make him sound more proper. Anyone who spoke to him after this point thought that he was this well-educated man. And there was a reason for all of this, behind all the madness, but no one would put that together until much later. Once released, his alias Roy Fontaine would be the only name that he would answer to. He created it with the actress Joan Fontaine in mind after watching one of her movies. Now, he started living in Soho at this time, and there were many gangs in the area that he tried to join. However, they didn't really trust him, and he eventually did move on to just working by himself. He would meet a woman named Margaret, who he would have a daughter named Caroline with. However, it was not biologically his daughter. He had met her when she was about 2 months pregnant and decided just to have her start living with him and adopt the child as his own. Of course, not legally, but in their mind and to this girl, he was her father. This was said to be mainly due to the fact that gay men often like to have a family as a front, and this was a family he could hide behind as a gay man. That didn't work out, and later he would marry a woman named Ruth Holmes, but they divorced not long after because while he was in jail and she was waiting for him, he basically told her not to because he would never love her as much as he loved a man named David Bernard. But when he was released, he actually went to be with David instead of her. However, David would die in a car accident only 4 weeks later. Throughout Archibald's time in London, he would be in prison many different times, and when Roy, or Archibald, met a man named Michael Keto, it was like looking in a mirror. You see, Michael Keto was said to have grown up in foster care. He never attached to anybody. He had gone to home to home to home. He didn't have a family, and so once he aged out, he did end up going into the armed services for a while, but he couldn't stop himself from continuing to be a thief, and he robbed a store, and he was then dishonorably discharged. He was also married twice in his life, but would be left each time because he would admit to being gay. Investigators believe that these two men in their custody were more than just partners in crime. They could be lovers, but they could also be a killer couple. But how many victims would be involved in this case? That's what they had no idea about. Neither of these men had resisted arrest, but they would soon only have one in custody, and that was because while they were still under interrogation, Archibald decided that he needed to go to the bathroom, and that is where he would escape through a window and run down the street to grab a taxi. He would end up telling the taxi that his wife had been in an accident. He needed to go see her in the hospital, but he didn't know what hospital she was at. So 3 hours of driving later, a police roadblock did end up getting him apprehended and putting him back in the police station. When both men were securely in custody, investigators did go back to trying to identify the man who was in their trunk. They did ask Archibald during the interrogation who was in the trunk and why. And at this point, he did open his mouth, but it was only to ask for a glass of water. They gave this to him, but they didn't know that he had a pill stuck up his bottom. He was going to swallow this in order to take his life and avoid the consequences of his actions. However, once they realized what he did, Archibald was rushed to the hospital where he did survive. At this point, the body in the trunk had been identified due to the criminal records that this John Doe had. This was found to be Donald Hall, Archibald's half-brother. He was 17 years younger than Archibald and had already been in prison. In fact, he had recently been released for pedophilia. The medical examiner found that he had drowned to death, but then they got another big break in this case, and that would be with the car that Archibald and Michael were found with. The description of this vehicle was found to be in another ongoing case that the police had. Earlier that month, it was early December, an antiques dealer had called the police after two men had come in and tried to sell him silver and china. They were only willing to sell it for way below what it was actually worth. When they tracked this car that he had seen, that is when it brought them to a flat in London. When they went inside, because nobody was answering, they found that blood was spattered all over one of the rooms and many valuables were missing. This was the home of Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. They had not been able to find the renters of the car that they were originally looking for, or the owners of the home, Dorothy and Walter, or their possible killers if it wasn't the renters of the car. Two more bodies were linked to these men, but that wouldn't be all, because a 51-year-old woman named Mary Coggle had been found deceased on December 25th, or Christmas Day. Her body had been dumped in a stream, and a medical examiner found that she had been stabbed to death with a poker. Mary Coggle's murder was then also linked to Archibald and Michael, because she had been the housekeeper for Walter and Dorothy at the time of their disappearances. She was also believed to have been seen at a Tilt hotel prior to her death with three other men, one being an extremely elderly man. Now, hotel employees did see the four of these people together, but then later on, only the two younger men would return. While investigators were finding out that these two men had four victims and doing everything in their power to understand why, Archibald again tried to take his life and was unsuccessful. Both men then began to admit what they had done because they knew that they couldn't get out of it. Now, Archibald claimed that before Michael Keto, before he ever met this other man, when he was a teen, a divorced neighbor offered him sex in return for a wealthy lifestyle that he got to live for a while. And this continued when he moved to London and was older, and he would get offers from older women all the time who had a life of luxury. And he decided he wanted to make that a permanent part of his life. It was something he had never had. He had grown up in a very hard-working but poor family, and he decided that he needed to work hard to get to the point that he wanted to be surrounded by elegance. And then he decided that even while at work, working for those things, he needed to be around luxurious things and people. And that is when he decided to be a butler, a job that put him inside the homes of the wealthiest people in London. And that is the exact reason why, while in jail, Archibald began to learn how to speak to people in a way that they would respect even if they were wealthy. This would allow him an in into their homes. However, the money he made while working as a butler wouldn't be enough for him. So he also was learning how to take advantage of people. His first big butler job would be for a woman named Lady Peggy Hudson. She came from a very wealthy family. She was also the widow of a wealthy man, and the manipulation from Archibald started from the very beginning, and Lady Hudson had no idea. You see, she would always used to eat at 8:15 p.m. However, people would see Archibald, who they knew as Roy, out at the local pub at around 7 p.m., and they would always ask him, "How are you here? Because Lady Hudson hasn't eaten yet." And he would say with a smirk that he had set the clocks forward, and so she had already eaten. This is where he would commit his first murder. This was one that investigators had no idea about. He said that Lady Hudson was great to him, and so when he was hired, there was also a gardener hired as well named David Wright. Archibald was quite pleased with himself because not only did he get himself the job, he also got David Wright the job, who was his lover from prison. They were cellmates, and they also planned to rob Lady Hudson together. However, everything would go horribly wrong because David decided he wanted to rob Lady Hudson right away, whereas Archibald was saying we should wait. We can get the combination to the safe if we just wait a little while. I know that there's more if we end up staying. And he also was kind of lingering on the idea of going straight and not even robbing her and just working as the butler that he was supposed to be doing. Soon enough, her ring as well as some silver were stolen by David, and David gave the ring to his girlfriend, but Archibald asked her to give it back, and David didn't agree with this. And one night Archibald actually woke up to a gunshot, and David was standing over him with a gun and had shot him, or close to him, in the headboard. He had missed because he was so drunk. Archibald had to talk him out of shooting him, but the next day, Archibald and David would go out to hunt some rabbits, each with a different reason in mind as to why. Only one would come back alive, and obviously Archibald would go on to kill more, so he was the one who survived, which meant he was the one who killed David, his partner in crime and lover. He admitted that David said, "Isn't it a lovely day?" And he said, "Yeah, it's a lovely day, but it's the last one that you'll have." And then he shot him in the head and buried him. Archibald claimed that because David was turning on him, he had this picture that he feared that David would go ahead and tell Lady Hudson of their plan and would expose their affair or his real name. However, this murder would be quite pointless because Lady Hudson would get a letter in the mail about a week later claiming that her butler wasn't who she believed him to be and was a convicted criminal. Archibald did believe that David had written this letter before his death. Prior to being kicked out of Lady Hudson's home, he would make sure that he was going to get away with murder. And so he would bring Lady Hudson's dog around the body, and if the dog wanted to go towards it, to smell it, he would cover it with more sand and rocks and leaves, and then eventually he got it to where the dog would just walk over the grave, and he knew he'd get away with it. This is when he found himself in Chelsea, London with the Scott Elliott family, and he found them to be easy targets as they needed help with almost everything, and they were barely hanging on to life at this point. They had bank accounts all over the world, and they also owned several homes. As a butler, he started to pay the bills for them, and Walter would even give him blank checks that he was supposed to write out for them, but he would end up just writing them to himself. During this time is when Archibald said he met Michael Keto, and Michael was not yet a killer. He was a thief, but he would work odd jobs to actually make money, but he wanted a life of luxury too, and Archibald would be the flame to his fire. Archibald soon told his new lover that the real reason he worked as a butler was to end up stealing everything from Walter and Dorothy. Michael was more than willing to help out when he realized how much money the Scott Elliots actually had. On December 8th, Archibald and Michael were both in the home looking around for different things to steal because Dorothy was at the nursing home at this time and Walter had taken pills and was in a very deep sleep. They stalked around the home trying to find anything that they could steal that wouldn't be missed immediately if they stole it, so they wouldn't be caught. An hour later, they were in Dorothy's room looking around, and that is when they would be startled because Dorothy would walk in. Of course, she screamed because she didn't know why her butler and the strange man were in her bedroom. Archibald claimed that he was afraid that she would cause someone to call the police, so he grabbed her, covered her mouth with his hand, and then suffocated her with a pillow. All to cover up with the fact that he was snooping around the home, and he believed that she would not allow him to continue working, and that would mean he wouldn't get any money. Now, Archibald was extremely sweaty, and he walked out of the room to do damage control to see if Walter was awake, and he was. He was walking out of the bedroom all groggy, and that is when Archibald told him that, Dorothy had the nightmare, and Walter didn't ask any questions. He just went back to the bedroom. So they thought that they were in the clear. But Archibald and Michael were on high alert, and while trying to figure out how to cover up this murder, they decided that he also had to die. So that is when they would get into the car, and they would have a woman dress up as Dorothy to sit next to him. This woman was none other than their housekeeper, Mary Coggle. She was the other accomplice. She was known as Belfast Mary, an estranged mother of 8 who was also a sex worker and a forger, and she had known Archibald for quite some time because they had met at the Whittingham Psychiatric Hospital and had an on-again, off-again relationship. She was actually the one to introduce Archibald to Michael, and that is when Mary and Archibald got themselves hired by the Scott Elliots and their plan began. When Walter got in the car that day, he had no idea that his real wife was deceased in the trunk and that Archibald carried a suitcase of all of their jewels and their valuables. Walter was too medicated to even really ask where they were going, but he was told by the butler that they needed to stop and dump some garbage during their drive. And that garbage was his murdered wife. They buried her body and then stopped at a cottage on the way to Scotland to rest. And with Mary playing the doting wife, Archibald and Michael then drove back to the Scott Elliots' home to ransack it to make it look more like this random burglary. The men then headed back to pick up Mary and Walter to continue their drive. Michael Keto, in interrogation, said that the Scott Elliots were the perfect find because they didn't have much time left, and he believed that Archibald would actually be put in their wills as well. When Michael said they had to kill Dorothy, he said at first they were going to make it look like an accident, but then they decided they were going to kill Walter as well, so they had to pretend that Mary was Dorothy for a while. And during this trip, it was about 5 days, and then it was Walter's time. He was pulled out of the car with a scarf around his neck, and at first he thought that the butler, Archibald, was being kind, putting a scarf around him because it was so cold outside. But then it began to tighten. As they tried to strangle him, he tried fighting back, and it unexpectedly hard for an 80-year-old man who was on these medications that made him groggy. And so they actually had to use a spade to hit him over the head until his skull split wide open. And then they buried him as well. Archibald and Michael then turned on their accomplice. They believed that Mary was going to cause them to get caught because she wouldn't take off Dorothy's coat and jewelry. That is when Michael tried to get in the middle of Archibald and Mary's fight, and she attacked him, and then Archibald attacked her, throwing her on the ground. Archibald then hit Mary with a poker before suffocating her in a plastic bag, and then they dumped her body as well. Archibald would later say that he regretted killing his old friend. By the time that Mary's body was found on that Christmas day, Michael and Archibald were in Scotland with his family. And then they were headed back to London with Donald Hall. He wanted to come along to see how they were making their money. And Archibald was allegedly one who hated Donald ever since Donald had been caught for pedophilia. Donald began to get curious about how they were making all of this money since the family never had any, and he was asking way too many questions. And that is when Archibald decided he had to go. He did not want to share the money that he would get from the Scott Elliots that he had just killed 3 people for. He chloroformed his own brother and then drowned him in the bath. And meanwhile, investigators were closing in on Mary Coggle's killer, as many had last seen her with these 2 men who were well-known thieves. At this time, Archibald and Michael were renting this new car, and they wouldn't have been suspected at all if Archibald didn't want to change the plate simply because it was 999 and he thought that that was bad luck. They drove to the Blenheim Home Hotel, and Donald was in the trunk still, because they hadn't had the chance to bury him because it was snowing, the ground was frozen, and they couldn't. And the rest would be history, because Archibald and Michael finally told investigators where the victims were buried. Dorothy had been left on the side of the road. Mary's body had already been located in a stream, and of course, Donald Hall was found in the trunk. David Wright was also found in the stream nearby where Mary was found, near Lady Hudson's home. In the freezing cold, while it snowed, investigators headed out to the dumping grounds to dig for these bodies. When they found them, Archibald and Michael were officially charged with these 5 murders. But as far as motive or remorse, Archibald said, "I can't feel anything for killing these 5 people, not even remorse." However, it was theorized that Archibald had killed Donald because of him being a child pedophile and the fact that Archibald had the little girl. During the trial, Archibald called Michael lazy, weak, and greedy, and that he killed Dorothy alone, and that Archibald had to kill Walter and Mary due to that. Michael said that Archibald was the one who killed Dorothy, and he also said that Mary's death was just an accident, but then investigators proved that to be false. Donald's death was also found not to actually be because of drowning, but because they used so much chloroform, and this was the first murder in British history that chloroform had been used as the murder weapon. Archibald was deemed a psychopath, and he finally confessed, but he was sentenced to 4 life sentences instead of for the 5 murders. But the 5th murder wasn't brought to trial, and this was Dorothy's murder. It was ordered to lie on file. This is actually an English law where the judge can deem that there's not enough evidence in that case for it to actually go to trial. But this is mainly because they already have charges against that person that are often more serious. These charges can be reinstated, but only with the permission of the trial judge or the Court of Appeal, and it has not been done. In England, the judge called Archibald cold-blooded and recommended that he never be released. In Scotland, they did recommend that he serve a minimum of 15 years. Now, Michael Keaton was given 3 life sentences, of course, for Donald, Walter, and Mary, but not for Dorothy, nor David, because he wasn't anywhere near them when David was killed. Investigators, though, claim that he was lucky because Archibald was planning to kill him next. He was recommended a 15-year minimum in England, and in Scotland, no minimum recommendation. Archibald Hall was then placed on the list of dangerous prisoners who would serve a whole life tariff. And when he was placed on this list, his sentence did not change. Most of the time, when a criminal is placed on this, their sentence can be elevated. However, his was not changed. Archibald was known to be the oldest prisoner on that list. 17 years later, he requested the right to die. He said, "Death will be my release. Not until I am dead can I escape these walls. To anyone who thinks they have the capacity for murder, I urge you to think again. My life is an impoverished nightmare. Let it be a lesson to you." But he also admitted killing 2 more people. He said he killed an American helicopter pilot as well as a garage worker, but he refused to say anything else, so they have not been identified. He did try to take his life many more times, even going on a hunger strike, but nothing worked. And then 4 years later, in 1999, he did come out with an autobiography called A Perfect Gentleman. He described himself as a mastermind, a perfect criminal, a man who used everything and everyone around him for his schemes and nothing more. He said, "There is a side of me when aroused that is cold and completely heartless." Many of the statements made by Archibald, including what he did to his victims, were said to be possibly fictionalized. He was a good liar, and to him the truth did not come easy. He did not like to speak of the truth, and most of what he said, including, what was in his autobiography, was, if not fiction, a very far off version of the truth. It's unknown how much of his confessions to police or of his book contain actual facts. And since the victims are gone, all we have is his word. Archibald did die of a stroke in 2002 at the age of 78, and I was unable to find the whereabouts of Michael Keaton because he has been released. Now, a 2011 film was going to be made called The Monster Butler. However, due to the lack of funding, it was canceled. Once this case came out and Archibald was caught, a man named Ian Moore came forward to say that he easily could have been a victim. He said that Archibald had stayed at his bed and breakfast, and Ian had found him on the side of the road with a broken down car and offered him a place to stay. Ian said that he would often talk to Archibald because he lived in the guest house and they lived in the real house with his family. Archibald at this time went by Dr. Roy Fontaine to them, and Ian invited him to travel across the country with him to deliver farm machinery. Ian said he didn't believe for a minute he was a doctor, but he was a good friend, and it was eerie to know now that he could have killed not only him, but his entire family. Ian said he even kept Archibald's car for 2 years while he was in prison. This was allegedly for selling secret papers to the Russians, and Archibald would tell them that it was a miscarriage of justice, that he was not guilty. And then later, during this murder spree that Archibald and Michael were having, Ian and Archibald caught up once again. Ian Moore said even then he would have never believed that Archibald was a serial killer. Do you think that if Dorothy hadn't caught them that day, that they would have killed Dorothy and Walter and then Mary? I think that, David and Donald were ones that were going to happen regardless of that incident. But it does make me wonder if they would have waited it out and really just waited for them to pass away if Dorothy had not come home. I have not done a very vintage case in a while, but this one was so crazy, and it's, known as the forgotten serial killer because there are a lot of people who have no idea who Archibald Hall or Roy Fontaine is. And not that I want to give him any exposure, but his victims do deserve that. And of course, that is what we like to talk about here on this channel. So yeah, don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.